Okay, wow, I see that when I looked at my timer, I had gone for about 22 minutes there, and I had cut off half of my face. So I hope now you're able to see my whole face. And we were just getting ready to talk about how common are gifted and talented children. So this is interesting. It is a small group. So out of 100, there are going to be just a few who really could be defined as this category of gifted and talented. And maybe we can start out by looking at how IQ tests would define this, because that's the oldest way that many school districts used to identify children, and unfortunately it is sometimes in some school districts the primary way that they still use to select these students. So if we look at IQ testing, just by the structure of how a bell-shaped curve is set, I think you know this, but standardized testing is set up so that the grades appear on and fit the bell-shaped curve. So when I make this gesture of what a bell-shaped curve looks like, there's a high number of people at the top of the curve, right? And then as the curve starts to go down, there are fewer numbers of students within these categories. And then as you get to where the top and bottom ends of this bell-shaped curve tail out, that particular section of a bell-shaped curve contains on each end, but definitely on the gifted end, 2.3% of the population. So if that sort of testing is going to be the main determinant, it will always be 2.3% if standardized testing that's been normed on a bell-shaped curve is used as the standard. And so that's just interesting. That 2.3%, by the way, would equal 2 standard deviations above the mean. So if a standard IQ and average IQ is 100, and then a standard deviation from that, one step up, if you will, is 15 extra points, another standard deviation upward would mean an IQ of 130. So 2 standard deviations above the mean. All of that talk is related to using just IQ and standardized test scores as the determining factor. But it is felt in today's world that using this measure of IQ and standardized testing doesn't really capture all of the students, because students are gifted in different ways that sometimes don't involve academic achievement. So I do have in my notes, I have to say something else about why using these tests and IQ scores is not the best way. Partly I've said this to you before, that tests can even inherently inside the test, on the test questions, have what's called culture bias. And partly this refers to students who don't have English as their first language, so they might miss the nuances of a test question in terms of how it's asked, because maybe their usage of English is not completely proficient. But another piece of culture bias is if a student, let's say, came from another country and had been going to school in a different country's school system, there may be things that are typical to an American classroom and the American experience of learning, materials in the classroom, toys in the classroom, activities that are done in the United States that maybe aren't done in India or in Pakistan or in who knows where. And so asking test questions that include those little pieces of culture within the question can be, cause a child to miss the answer. And so this is what is referred to as culture bias in testing. And you should know that standardized test constructors, the big companies, are very sensitive to this and work all the time now to remove any perceived culture bias in test items, test questions, as they're making them up. That's really interesting, actually. Let's see. Also, another factor that kind of creates a bias in standardized testing is that some of the test questions might ask about something like making a trip to the circus or going to the zoo And if a child hasn't had an exposure of ever going to a zoo because their family can't afford it, or they don't have a car, or that both parents work all the time and they've just never had a chance to go to a zoo, this is another way that, you know, these tests can be biased. Excuse me. So not all areas of giftedness are able to be measured by this academic kind of standard way of doing it. I did want to call to your attention, I have in my notes on page 443, there's quite a detailed list of the kinds of questions teachers might use to identify students who may be gifted and talented. And this sort of gets to the idea of, hold on you guys, let me back up because I think I had my pages numbered wrong. I want to go back to culture fair assessment. Page 444, I guess I'm just letting you know, page 444 discusses current best practices for identifying students as gifted, and this is all a part of that discussion about culture fair assessment. Hold on, yeah, I do have mine. Okay. Culture, current best practice, as part of this idea is to recognize that underrepresented children with high abilities probably have not had the exposure to experiences that would help them develop all the identifier abilities. So let me say that again. The idea of using best practices to eliminate culture bias is part of this idea is that kids who haven't had the exposure to experiences, this is kind of like what I was saying to you before about going to the zoo or attending a parade, that kids might not have had the exposure to develop understandings and abilities that the general public, we're making assumptions that the average kid gets average experiences, right? And so these best practices try to eliminate that. So on page 444, here are some, I'll just read a couple of these bullets to you. A multimodal or multifaceted identification process identifies students with a goal of inclusion versus having a goal of exclusion. That's a different attitude in terms of identifying gifted and talented children. Also, this kind of looking or searching for the student gathers data from multiple sources, providing both objective and subjective information. So, parent interviews, individual intelligence testing, performance on group solving skills, problem solving skills, motivational factors and behavioral factors, and individual conferences, even with the child themselves. So you can see that these are much more varied ways of gathering information about children like this than just looking at their test score and picking them, you know, off the list of the top 3 students. There is something called the Discover procedure, which was developed in 2005. It's a particularly multimodal kind of discovery procedure to find these children, not just through test scores. And it was developed by, I think it's June Maker is her name. And how does this work? It provides, this is kind of a cool process. The Discover procedure provides for kids a set of complex problems and then asks them to come up with solutions and work through processes to think of creative solutions, solutions with no limits, no cost, that kind of thing. And as the child is able to successfully and creatively solve one level of a problem, then the Discover procedure presents to the child a new problem that's even more complex and requires more deep thinking or more broad creativity. And so the child continues to be asked these problems until they sort of top out, if you will. And this is a way to kind of identify kids who can think divergently, and sometimes they're even interacting with other children as we're doing this to solve these problems. And so that's what the Discover process is about. It's really a good one. I'm going to read to you oh gosh, if I can find it, yeah, on the bottom of page 444, there's a description of a girl named Little Claudia. And so let me read this to you. Little Claudia, a 5-year-old Mexican-American girl who was responsible for dressing her 2-year-old brother and making sure he was taken to daycare before she went to kindergarten, has had extensive practice in problem solving. However, she was not exposed to advanced knowledge through visits to museums or a home environment with many sources of information, nor was she given opportunities to produce sophisticated products through being able to take special courses or having special lessons or other opportunities afforded to children from middle and upper class socioeconomic status families. Many children from diverse economic, geographic, and cultural groups face challenges similar to little Claudia. So that's a great paragraph to read and for you to listen to and understand in terms of trying to make sure that children who are given tasks that aren't sort of mainstream creative or enrichment tasks, but they have to learn how to do things very quickly and think fast, can be identified sometimes as gifted children. Okay, let's see. We just have a few more things to talk about, and I think my timer's getting ready to stop. I'm going to stop this clip and then start a new one.